The sun was just beginning to dip behind the tree line when Daniel pulled his rusted-out station wagon into the quiet rest stop off the interstate. A tired sigh escaping his lips as he glanced at the rearview mirror to see his 6-year-old daughter, Emma, asleep in her booster seat with a tattered stuffed bunny clutched tightly to her chest. And for a brief moment, the weariness of the long drive melted under the warmth of her innocent face.
Ow.
But reality set back in as his stomach growled, and he remembered they hadn't eaten a real meal in nearly a day. Just some crackers and a shared juice box. And tonight wasn't going to be much different because his wallet held only a few wrinkled bills and a couple of coins. Not enough for a motel or a hot dinner, but Daniel had learned to survive on very little ever since his wife passed. Away 2 years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter alone while working odd jobs and sleeping in the car whenever he couldn't scrape enough together for rent. And tonight, as twilight painted the sky in soft purple hues, he opened the trunk, pulling out a tiny portable stove, a battered pan, and a pack of instant noodles he'd saved for such a night while Emma stirred awake, rubbing her eyes and smiling sleepily as she greeted him with a soft "Daddy, are we home?" Which twisted his heart a little because home was now wherever they stopped for the night. And as he kissed her forehead and told her they'd camp here tonight like adventurers, her giggle made the lie feel just a little less painful. So he laid out a threadbare picnic blanket on the grass near a quiet corner of the rest area, far from the restroom lights and vending machines, under a crooked old tree, where he began heating the water on the stove while Emma sat cross-legged, humming to herself and arranging a tiny tea party for her bunny with bottle caps and stones. And all of it might have looked humble to someone passing by, even pitiful. But to Emma, it was magical, because her father made every moment feel safe and full of love, no matter how little they had. Unaware that just a few yards away, behind the tinted windows of a sleek, black luxury RV, parked under the glow of a nearby street lamp, a woman named Celeste watched the entire scene unfold from behind a delicate porcelain teacup, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she tried to sip the chamomile tea. She'd made herself because despite the high-end appliances in her designer RV and the millions sitting quietly in untouched accounts, her heart felt hollow, her soul heavy with a silence she hadn't shared with anyone in months. And as she watched the father and daughter, so different, yet so warm together, something inside her stirred a longing, a memory, maybe even regret, as she observed the man carefully break the noodles in half to stretch the meal and then divide it into 2 mismatched bowls, placing more in Emma's than in his own without hesitation. And Celeste, the CEO of a global fashion empire who had once graced magazine covers and gala stages, suddenly felt like an outsider to life, staring through glass at something real and intimate that her wealth could never buy, as though she had fled the emptiness of her Beverly Hills mansion in search of peace and anonymity. All she had found was loneliness and designer packaging, and now her eyes, misty and wide, were glued to the scene unfolding outside as Daniel wiped his daughter's mouth gently and listened to her chatter about imaginary dragons and pink castles and how the stars looked like tiny marshmallows in the sky, nodding along and laughing, with genuine joy despite the ache in his back and the exhaustion in his bones, while Celeste clutched the edge of the small table in her RV, feeling something cracking inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the tragic day. Her younger brother died in a car crash she always blamed herself for, the brother who was her only family and whose absence she tried to bury under work, success, and noise, until the silence screamed louder than the world ever could, and in that rest stop bathed in silver moonlight and soft cricket song. Daniel and Emma finished their humble dinner, rinsed the bowls with a water bottle, and settled into their makeshift bed in the car, where Daniel read from a worn-out children's book with missing pages, using different voices to make Emma laugh, his arm wrapped around her as she snuggled closer, whispering that he was the best daddy in the world. And those words, so pure and undeserved in his eyes, carried more weight than $1 million bonus, or a promotion ever could, while Celeste sat frozen, tears trickling down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying, her reflection in the polished glass suddenly looking unfamiliar, haunted, tired, alone. And she whispered to herself, "What am I doing?" Because for the first time in years, She felt more moved by a child's giggle and a father's devotion than any red carpet or executive summit. And that night, as the rest stop grew quieter and a cool breeze swept through the trees, Celeste found herself stepping away from the comfort of her luxury interior and standing by the tinted window in her silk robe and cashmere slippers, looking out at the father-daughter duo fast asleep in the cramped car, blankets pulled up too. Their chins, Daniel's head tilted uncomfortably against the window. And something about that sight made her walk over to the drawer where she kept her old travel mug and fill it with the leftover tea, her hands trembling not from the cold but from the weight of a decision she didn't understand yet. And with one final breath, she unlocked the RV door and stepped out into the cool night air for the first time in weeks. Barefoot on the grass, drawn toward the little station wagon like a moth to warmth, unsure what she would say or do, but knowing she couldn't just stay inside and pretend she hadn't seen the kind of love and simplicity she had forgotten even existed. Daniel stirred slightly in the front seat, his neck aching from the awkward angle. Sunlight streaming through the car window and warming his face as birds chirped in the trees above. And when he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Emma's peaceful little face resting on his arm, her chest gently rising and falling, her bunny cradled between her knees, and for a brief second, he felt something close to peace before the weight of their situation returned. The empty gas tank, the dwindling cash, the job interview that fell through, and the long road still ahead with no destination in sight. But then his attention shifted to something strange through the car window, a steaming cup of tea placed carefully on the hood with a folded note under it. And Daniel slowly pushed open the car door, squinting in the daylight, heart pounding slightly as he stepped out and looked around, spotting no one in sight except a sleek black RV parked several yards away, its windows reflecting the morning sky. And when he opened the note with cautious fingers, he found simple handwriting that read, "This looked like it might warm your morning, from a neighbor who sees more than you think." And he stared at it, puzzled, eyes drifting back to the luxurious RV, its tinted windows hiding whoever lived inside. And though part of him bristled with pride and confusion, another part felt strangely comforted that someone had seen their struggle and cared enough to leave something behind. So he brought the tea back to the car and set it down on the dashboard. And when Emma finally woke, yawning and stretching like a little kitten, her first question was whether they were going to have pancakes for breakfast, to which he smiled and shook his head, joking that today they were having royal tea in a very fancy cafe with a car-shaped booth and a grass carpet view, making her giggle before she sipped the tea and made a funny face, claiming it tasted like flowers, but she drank it anyway while hugging her bunny. And Daniel, who hadn't had anything warm in days, took small sips too, feeling the heat spread through his chest and settle in his belly. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely invisible. Unaware that inside the RV, Celeste was sitting at her window again, having watched him discover the tea and read the note, her heart tight with emotion she couldn't name, because something about that man and his daughter tugged at memories buried deep. At laughter once shared with her brother in the parks of their childhood, when money didn't matter and love was all they needed. And she'd sat at that table every morning with coffee that tasted like ash, checking emails she no longer cared about until now, when she waited instead to see what Daniel would do next, who he really was. Why he stirred such a deep ache in her chest that it felt almost like loss and hope tangled into one. And that afternoon, after Emma collected wildflowers and Daniel checked the map on his phone for nearby towns, realizing they'd have to stretch the last gallon of gas until he found work, Celeste stepped out again, this time with more courage. Wearing a white linen blouse and simple jeans that hadn't seen daylight in weeks, brushing her hair behind her ears nervously as she approached, the car end called out gently, "Hi there, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to introduce myself." And Daniel turned, startled, quickly standing up and instinctively stepping in front of his daughter, unsure whether to smile or apologize. But the woman's face was kind, her posture soft, and she held out her hand and said, "I'm Celeste. I've been parked here overnight too." And after a pause, Daniel shook her hand and gave his name. Then Emma peeked out from behind his leg and said, "Are you the one? Who made the flower tea?" To which Celeste laughed and nodded, kneeling to Emma's level and saying, "I used to call it fairy tea when I was your age, and that was the beginning of a slow but remarkable unraveling." Because Celeste didn't return to her RV right away, instead, sitting down with them on the blanket as Emma invited her to the tea party, handing her a bottle cap and calling her Princess Flower Cup. And Daniel, though hesitant at first, watched the way Celeste listened to his daughter's wild stories and responded with wide-eyed wonder and play, something he hadn't seen in another adult since his wife passed, and it disarmed him, making his guard drop just a little. Enough for him to offer her a cup of real tea from the travel mug she'd gifted earlier. And Celeste, who had once sat beside prime ministers and media moguls, now felt more alive holding that dented thermos and sitting barefoot in the grass while Emma braided her hair with weeds and called her queen of the stop. For hours they talked. Not about business or resumes or accounts, but about road trips and favorite snacks and silly games. Until Daniel realized he was smiling more in that single afternoon than he had in months, and when Emma dozed off for a nap under the tree, Celeste finally asked him softly why they were on the road, and Daniel didn't lie or embellish. He just told her the truth, that life had been hard, that his wife had died of cancer, that he lost his job trying to take care of her, and that every time he thought he was getting ahead, something knocked them down again, and Celeste listened without judgment or pity, her eyes shining with empathy, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't listening like a CEO or a fixer, but like a human being who had also known loss. And when she finally said, "You're a remarkable father," Daniel shook his head and muttered, "I'm just trying not to fail her," and she whispered back, "That's what makes you remarkable." And the words sat between them like a fragile thread of light. And they didn't say much after that, just sat in the quiet while birds chirped and the wind rustled the trees until Emma woke up and declared she was hungry. And Celeste offered to cook something, and though Daniel tried to refuse, saying he didn't want charity, Celeste only smiled and said, "Then consider it repayment for the tea party." And so they walked together to the RV, where Emma's eyes lit up at the sight of the sleek interior. Celeste opened drawers full of ingredients Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. Pasta, fresh vegetables, spices, and together they made a meal with Emma helping stir and set the table while Daniel chopped carrots with a hand steady for the first time in days. And when they finally sat down to eat at a folding table set outside the RV, it felt like something sacred, a strange family dinner under the open sky, full of laughter and little stories, and Celeste looked at them both with an ache she didn't understand, something like love forming quietly in the middle of nowhere. And as the afternoon turned into golden early evening, Daniel realized something had changed, not in the world around him, but inside him. Like hope had found a small place to sit again. And though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether this beautiful stranger would still be here when he woke, for tonight he was full not just from the food, but from the presence of someone who saw him, who didn't look away, and for Celeste, who had spent years trying to outrun grief and disguise her emptiness with perfection, that moment with this struggling father and a bright-eyed little girl felt more like home than all the mansions she had ever built. That night, as the stars blinked into view one by one, and the scent of rosemary and garlic still lingered in the air from the shared meal outside the RV, Daniel sat beside the small campfire Celeste had built while Emma danced in circles nearby, in her mismatched socks, pretending the moon was a crown and she was the queen of the night sky, and Celeste watched from a lawn chair, laughing softly whenever Emma insisted that Princess Flower Cup must now knight her bunny as royal protector of all rest stops, and Daniel couldn't stop smiling, even though deep down a small voice kept reminding him this couldn't last, that maybe this was just a kind-hearted stranger offering them a good day but nothing more. And yet when he glanced at Celeste again, her eyes met his with a warmth that felt steady, not fleeting, and for a man who had learned not to expect much from anyone, he didn't know what to do with that kind of steady warmth, so he kept his gaze low and let the fire do the talking while Celeste gently brushed the dirt off Emma's hands and said she could sleep inside the RV tonight if she wanted, which made Emma gasp with joy and Daniel hesitate, because accepting kindness felt a lot like admitting they needed it. But then Emma tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, she has the softest bed in the world, and you can sleep too." And Daniel looked at Celeste, who only said quietly, "I'd be honored." And so that night, Daniel carried his sleeping daughter into the guest bunk of a luxury RV and tucked her under Egyptian cotton sheets, while her bunny sat guard at her side. And then he lay awake on the narrow couch in the main cabin, staring at the ceiling and wondering how a stranger had so completely stepped into their lives and made it feel like they weren't drowning anymore. And somewhere around 3 a.m., he finally slept, and when he awoke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of soft humming, he almost forgot for a second that it wasn't a dream until he saw Celeste in the tiny RV kitchen, flipping pancakes in a pan with a sleepy smile on her face, and Emma sitting at the counter with syrup smeared on her cheeks, and the bunny wearing a tiny paper crown and something inside. Daniel gave way and cracked open, not from pain, but from unfamiliar safety, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like running or fixing or apologizing. He just stood there in his socks and rumpled t-shirt and whispered, "Thank you." And Celeste turned and smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world to make breakfast for someone she'd only known a day. And after they ate, they sat outside again, this time in folding chairs with real mugs of coffee, while Emma painted rocks with glitter glue and told them all about the magical RV castle. And Daniel found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years, not because he was looking for sympathy, but because somehow Celeste made it easy to talk, and she listened with the kind of focus that made his words feel important. And when he asked her why she was traveling alone, she didn't flinch or avoid. She just said, "I was chasing peace, but I didn't realize it wasn't about places, it was about people." And Daniel knew exactly what she meant and when. Emma came running over holding a rock she'd painted to look like a heart. She handed it to Celeste and said, "This is so you never forget us." And Celeste pressed it to her chest and whispered, "I won't." And from that moment, the idea of goodbye became unbearable, and yet they didn't talk about what came next, because saying goodbye would make it real, and neither of them wanted to go back to the lives they had before. Not Daniel, who had spent years surviving without truly living, and not Celeste, who had spent years surrounded by success, but completely alone. And so they stayed another night, and then another, Emma calling the RV home, and Daniel fixing a leaky pipe in the RV kitchen without being asked, and Celeste laughing louder each day, until one morning a week later, as they sat at a picnic table under a blooming cherry tree at a local park they'd driven to together, Daniel looked up from his coffee and asked, what would happen if they just kept going together? And Celeste stared at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face for doubt or hesitation, but she found none. So she took his hand across the table and said, "Then let's go." And that was how a single dad and a billionaire in hiding became something that didn't have a name at first, just a unit a makeshift family forged. Not in history, but in choice. And wherever they stopped next, Daniel always found work fixing things or helping out, and Celeste always found ways to quietly help others. They met giving warm meals to roadside vendors, tipping waitresses, double repairing someone's broken wheelchair, and Emma kept collecting painted rocks from each place, adding them to her growing collection of memories. And at night they read books together in the RV, Daniel doing silly voices, Celeste brushing Emma's hair, and every time Emma said, "I love our life now," neither of them corrected her. And months passed like that, until one day, while passing through a quiet town, they stopped at a community center where Daniel was asked to help install new lights, and Celeste offered to help with a fundraiser, and someone recognized her not by her name, but by her face, and whispered, "Isn't that the woman from the magazines?" And suddenly Celeste felt the walls creeping back in the old life, with its cameras and pressure. But before panic could set in, Daniel reached for her hand, and Emma hugged her waist, and Celeste smiled and said, "Yes, that used to be me." And then she gave a speech about second chances and invisible lives, and people clapped, not for her wealth or status, but for her story. And that night she told Daniel she wasn't afraid anymore, because for the first time in her life, she was seen not as a brand, but as a woman. And he held her close and said, "You were always more than all that." And she kissed him, not out of gratitude, but because she wanted to, and because love had grown slow and quiet between them. like wildflowers along a forgotten road, and sometime after that, they bought an old plot of land, where wild grass grew high and Emma could chase butterflies, and Daniel built a tiny home with his hands, and Celeste turned the RV into a mobile library and named it the Rolling Heart, and every week they drove it to towns and parks and schools where kids who had little could borrow books and feel seen, and Emma handed out heart-shaped rocks and called herself the official magic keeper, and no one corrected her. And life wasn't perfect or polished, but it was full and real, and Daniel still had moments where he woke up afraid. Might all vanish, but then Celeste would bring him coffee and kiss his forehead, and Emma would snuggle between them with her bunny, and Daniel would remember that sometimes the universe gives you back what you lost, not in the way you expected, but in a way that heals you better. And Celeste sometimes stood at the edge of the property, watching the sun set with tears in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of quiet gratitude. And when asked once at a town hall meeting who she really was, she smiled and said, just someone who finally came home. And when Daniel looked at her across a crowded room, he always saw the woman who stepped out of her RV, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And when Emma grew older and asked them how they met, they always said with a laugh, it started with noodles and fairy tea at a rest stop where a billionaire found her. Heart in the arms of a poor man and his daughter, and nothing was ever the same again.